Good afternoon. I hope you're all doing great. Today we're learning Maseches Gittin Daf Samach Hey and as well Daf Samach Vav. Amud Aleph, we'll be going to the Mishnah that's about 2/3 of the way down, and then we'll be stopping there. Right now we're in the middle of a sugya. We've been discussing the level of trust that we have for a katan, and we had seemed to say that we trust kids when it comes to Dinei Dirabanan. Yesterday's example was Shitufe Mavuos, that when we have a father who's trying to place food to function as the eruv for shitufe mavuos, that even a child can do so. And the Gemara said that's not a raya that we trust children. We only trust children by dinei derabbanan, but by dinei deoraisa, that's not true. And we're picking up on the heels of that right now on Samach Hey Amud Aleph, 4 lines down. Masiv Ravavya, I can bring you another raya where we trust children, and lechora, it's a din deoraisa. Says the Gemara, ma'arimin al meiser sheni. There's a way to do a loophole to cash out on meiser sheni. If I wanted to take meiser sheni of my own and cash it out, there's a 20% slap on the wrist. But if I have somebody else do it, then I don't have to do the 20%. So says the Gemara as follows, Ketzad. The Brisa reads, how do we do this? So Omer Adam Livno Uvito Hagadolim La'avdo V'Shivchaso Ha'ivrim. A man can say to his sons and daughters who are older, or he can say to his servants, shivchos and shivchos who are Jews, Heilachem mos halalu. Here are these coins. Ufdu bahen meiser sheni zeh, and you do the transaction. It's my money. You do the transaction. I thereby save the 20% slap on the wrist. Now, hi shivcha hechidami. We asked a similar line of questioning yesterday. What is the status of this shivcha? Ida asya beis saros. If she's reached a point in her development where she's starting to grow some pubic hairs even too, then my boya gabe. Once that happens, she no longer is obligated to be a shivcha. She goes free at that point. Ella says the Gemara, lalav, it must be the lo asya beis saros. It must be that she's a ketana, that she doesn't have beis saros, and therefore we see that she's trusted. So this is a kashi on the answer that we said yesterday, because yesterday we had said that we trust children only by dinei derabanan, but not by dinei deoraisa. Yet over here, it seems to be that we trust children, a shivcha, shelo hevia beis saros, which is a ketana, that we trust her even by dinei deoraisa, even by meiser sheni. Says the Gemara, not necessarily true, because hacha b'maya skinan, what must we be dealing with? The Gemara says, b'meiser bizman hazeh, which is derabanan. Perhaps we're talking about a today time, when meiser that we do on money is a beautiful thing, but it's not a din deoraisa. So says the Gemara, wait one second. That's an impossible answer. You can't tell me that we're talking about meiser bizman hazeh. Why not? Because you're talking about a shivcha, which doesn't exist bizman hazeh. Says the Gemara, ve'ama ha'ivriya bizman hazeh mi'ika. How could it be that the case that we're dealing with when we're trying to circumvent paying the 20% slap on the wrist when we cash out on meiser sheni, how can you say, you're talking out of both sides of your mouth, how can you say that we're talking about a time when meiser doesn't apply, but at the same time we're talking about a time when a shivcha does apply? That doesn't make any sense. After all, says the Gemara, and this is a great mari makom for those who are interested in slavery nowadays in regards to halachic terms of having an eved ivri. It doesn't work. Why not? Because v'hatanya, we have a brisa. Ein eved ivri noheg el bizman sheha yovel noheg. The only time we're able to have an eved ivri is in a time when the yovel applies. And right now we don't know where yovel is. When yovel is, I should say. And therefore, there's no shivcha. So it doesn't make sense. Ella, says the Gemara, you're right. What must we have been talking about in regards to the case of meiser sheni, in regards to the katan that we trust? It must be, says the Gemara, Ella ba'atzitz she'eino nakuv, and we're talking about a din derabanan. The Gemara circumvents the case of meiser sheni, which generally speaking is a din deoraisa, but in this particular case, the Gemara creates an ukimta and says that this brisa of ma'arim es meiser sheni must be talking about a case of an atzitz she'eino nakuv. It's a flower pot where vegetation is growing. However, while the vegetation is growing, there's no hole in the bottom of the flower pot. It's growing in on its own. Had there been a hole in the bottom of the flower pot, we would have assumed that it was connected to the ground in some way, shape, and form, and possibly we would have had meiser sheni deoraisa, but that's not the case over here, and therefore we see that we only trust ketanim by dinei derabanan and not by dinei deoraisa. About a third of the way down, the Gemara says, Omar Rava, Gimel Midos Bekatan. There are 3 stages in regards to a katan and their trustworthiness. Here's level number 1. Tziror v'zarko egos v'nodlo. One type of child has the capacity for discernment. He sees that the tzaror, that the stone in this mixture of stones and nuts, the stones are garbage. However, the egos is worth saving. In such a case, that child is zoche la'atzmo ve'ein zoche la'acher. We saw this Gemara yesterday in another context. And the Gemara says that this child can be zoche la'atzmo, but he can't be zoche la'acherim. That's how much we trust him. Uchanegdan, in regards to females, biktana miskadeshes lemiyun. In regards to this, that a woman can be miskadeshes to the point that she's allowed to do miyun. Now, we've learned already that miyun is basically an outright rejection of marriage, but it only applies for a very narrow sliver of time. It only applies for a young girl where her father's able to marry her off, but she can get divorced without a proper get. This is a very low level of trust. And that's stage one. Stage two of Rava's 3 tiers is as follows. Hapeutos, young children, mekhan mekachu memkiran memkar b'metaltalin. This is another level. Children who have the capacity to run their own little business. So that child we trust in regards to his mekachu memkar, but only in regards to movable objects. Uchanegdan mektana miskareshes b'kedushe avia. That the father may be able to marry her off, and she's also allowed to get divorced from that. That's the level to which we trust her. And the third level, and with this we'll get to the end of the Mishnah, higia la'onas nedarim. Once we get to the level where we trust a person to make a neder, to take a neder upon themselves, nidrehem neder b'hekdesh and hekdesh. If a child is able to understand nedarim and understand the impact of nedarim, so then we do trust him. However, uchanegdan biktana choletzas. Not however, I should say. Really, it should be that the equivalent in regards to girls is that if she were to have gotten married as a ktana, she would do chalitza. And lastly, when it comes to selling the properties of one's father after he dies, the Gemara says the din is ad she'ehei ben esrim. You have to be 20 years old. We don't assume that you have the cup for that, even if you have the general discernment of a businessman by age 12, you're running your own lemonade stand, you're pulling in money on penny stocks, doesn't matter. We only trust you to a certain degree in certain areas. But when it comes to selling the nichse aviv, there we don't trust you, and you have to be 20 years old for that to happen. The Gemara now picks up with a new Mishnah, and the Gemara says as follows. Kitana she'amra, if we have a girl who's married, but she's young, she's not yet bas mitzvah, and she says to a man, to Shimon, hiskabel li giti, please go be the recipient for my get. The Gemara says, Eino get ad sheyagia get liyada. It won't be considered a get until she receives it in her hand. In other words, her assigning of a shliach does not work. Lefichach, imratza habal lachzor yachzor, if after Shimon, who receives the get, after the Ketana says hiskabel li giti, and then Ruvain gives the get to Shimon the shliach, he can be choser because that's not considered shlichus. Why is it not considered shlichus? Because the Ketana has no shlichus. That's what the Mishnah says halfway down, 4 lines into this new Mishnah. She'ein katan ose shliach. Children are not allowed to set for shlichus at all. Says the Mishnah, V'im amarlo aviha, if the father would have said to Shimon, Tsevi his kabelabiti gita, then under those circumstances, im ratza lachzor lo yachzor. A father is absolutely allowed to set a shliach for his daughter, and therefore, once the shliach gets a hold of the get, when the father appoints the shliach on behalf of his daughter, that's a proper get, she's divorced, and then lo yachzor. Ha'omer, if there was a case where somebody said, Tain get zela ishti b'makom ploni, a husband, Ruvain, says to the shliach, I want you to give this get to my wife, but only in a specific place, only in building X, only at address Y, only in city A, whatever the case may be. The halacha is that we have to follow that, because if v'nasnu la b'makom acher, puzzle. Let's say I want the get delivered to 123 Main Street, and he delivers it to 121 Main Street next door. The din is that the get is puzzled, they're still married. Harehi b'makom ploni. What if there's guidance? He's simply saying, I think my wife is in 123 Main Street. I'm not saying that tonight that you have to give it in that place. I'm just saying that that's where she might be located. Please go give this to my wife. She's located at 123 Main Street. That's different than saying, please go give it to my wife only in 123 Main Street. And therefore the din changes. V'nasnu b'makom acher, in such a case, kasher. Because there, the t'nai of the giving of the get wasn't that it had to be in 123 Main Street, but rather that she's probably there. If you're looking for her, that's probably where she is. Now, all of that is with the man talking. What if the woman is the one who's making these decisions? So says the Gemara as follows, 2/3 of the way down. Ha'isha she'amra, if a woman said, hiskabeli giti b'makom ploni, I'd like for you, Shimon, to be the recipient of my get in a specific place. and v'kiblu la b'macham acher, and Shimon, instead of accepting the get in 123 Main Street like she asked him to, he instead received it at 121 Main Street. So under those circumstances, according to the Tanakh apostle, Rabbi Yehuda Machshir, Rabbi Yehuda says, no, this get is perfectly kosher. Huge nafkamina, obviously, huge nafkamina. So we'll have to figure out why that's the case. What if a woman said, Haveli giti mimakom ploni? She said, I don't want you to be makabelet for me, but I do want you to be my shliach in as much as you'll be bringing it to me. So I'm not saying that when you Shimon the shliach, get the get from Reuven that I'm divorced. I want you to bring it to me, hand it to me, and then I'll be divorced. So says the Gemara, if a woman says, Haveli giti mimakom ploni, but veheviu la mimakom acher kosher, everyone agrees that that get is going to be kosher. And that brings us to the Gemara. We had seen in the Seifa of our Gemara a machlokes between the Tanakh and Reb Shimon. Rebbe Lazar said, and a few lines up from where we are, a few lines up from the Gemara, he was machshir in a case when a woman said to Shimon, he's kabbalah giti v'makom ploni, and he received it in another place. Why did he say kosher? So the Gemara says, Ma'ishna reisha de lo palig, u'ma'ishna seifa de palig. When the husband was the one who said, I want the get to be received at 123 Main Street, and it was instead received at 121 Main Street, we said it's pasul. Rebbe Lazar doesn't say boo. Everything's fine. But in the next case, when the woman says, I want you to be my shliach and please receive it only at 123 Main Street, and she receives it at another address, there Rebbe Lazar argues and says, no, that get is kosher. Why the distinction between the Reisha, but it's really not the Reisha, but between the first case of the Mishnah, where the husband is the one making the rules, as opposed to the one where the wife is the one making the rules? So the Gemara, of course, reminds us of a very important yesod when it comes to Gittin. Says the Gemara, Ma'ishna Reisha de lo Palig, Ma'ishna Seifa de Palig. Why is it that Rebbe Lazar argues only in the Seifa and not in the Reisha? Says the Gemara, because Ihu dimi daite megarish kapid. In a case where the husband is the one who is making all of the rules, so we know from the Torah that it's his power to get divorced. It's not her power to get divorced, and therefore, if he makes a t'nai, the t'nai matters. So if he says you can only give this get, Shimon the Shliach, you can only give it to her at 123 Main Street, that t'nai is a functional t'nai. She who gets divorced against her will under those circumstances, mar makom hilo. By her saying that I want you to go to 123 Main Street, that can't be a t'nai of divorce. She doesn't get to make a t'nai of divorce. She's not the one who effects divorce. He is. And therefore, even if she says, I'm only going to get divorced if you receive the get at 123 Main Street, that won't help. And therefore, in this case, Rebbe Lazar argues and says that it's kosher. Next Mishnah, really a continuation of the prior. The Mishnah says, 8-9 lines from the bottom of the page, Masnisin, Haveli Giti. If a woman says to Shimon the Shliach, please bring me my get, the halacha is ocheles b'truma get liyada. She's allowed to eat the truma, of course, if she's a Yisrael, who's Israeli, who's married to a Kohen. She's still allowed to eat the husband's truma until she actually gets the get into her hands, because that was her condition. The condition was that it had to be in my hands. I only said haveli, I didn't say he's kabel. Here, however, the Mishnah says in case number 2, 7 lines from the bottom, he's kabeli giti. If she says to Shimon, you are to receive it for me, so then the Gemara says things are different. If she makes Shimon the Shliach into a Shliach lekabala, under those circumstances, he's kabbalah giti. The halacha is asura le'echol b'truma miyad. Right away, she becomes asur, because we don't know when the moment will take place that Shimon the Shliach will receive the get. And the Gemara says he's kabbalah giti b'makom ploni. If this Mishnah is very similar in the case, but we'll see the halachos seem to be different, which we're going to ask on in a moment. If a woman says to Shimon the Shliach, I'd like you to be the recipient of my get, but only at 123 Main Street, then ocheles b'truma ad sheyagia get lo oso makom, then that condition seems to work. It's a stira, because in the previous Mishnah we said that she's not allowed to do that. Rabbi Lazar oser miyad, he says that it's asur right away. So says the Gemara, that's very odd. In this case, the last case that we just learned, if he's kabbalah giti b'makom ploni, that her condition seems to work, says the Gemara, v'gita mihahave, seems to be that the get is actually the case. But why? The ha'amris, you said in the previous Mishnah, which is 2/3 from the bottom of the page, where the case says he's kabbalah giti b'makom ploni, that there's a machlokes there between the Tanakh and Rebbe Lazar. The ha'amris reisha lo have gita. So how can it be that from one Mishnah to the next you have such a stira? The Gemara says, Lo tzricha de amar le his kabbalah gita b'mata mechasya. No, the case is where she said, I would like you to please receive the get while you're in mata mechasya. V'zimnin de mishkachas le bebavel. And sometimes the husband is found elsewhere. V'hachi ka amar le. This is in effect what she is saying to him. Mishkal, kol hecha de mishkachas lo shak lemine. I want you to take it, and in any way that you can take the get from Reuven, that's what I want you to do. turning to the top of Samach Hamid Beis. But Gita lo have adamatis lamata mechasya. If she is very, very specific in that way, she's making a taich on what the Kabbalah is. Not so much where the Kabbalah is. It is supposed to be Mat Mechasya. She's making something about the Kabbalah that it has to be in Mat Mechasya. This requires Rishonim because the distinction is extremely subtle, but nevertheless, this is the Gemara's answer. And the Mishnah had said, Rebbe Lazar Oser Miyad, Samach Hamid Beis, 2 lines down. This was the last part of the Mishnah from the bottom of Samach Hamid Aleph. And there we had said at the end of our Mishnah that according to the Tana Kama, that if a woman says, you, Shimon the Shliach, should receive my get, but only in a specific place, then she's ocheles b'trum until they get to that place. Rabbi Lazar says it's aser right away. So the Gemara says pshita. According to him, it should be obvious that it's aser because he holds that it's just a mari makom. The hamari makom hilo. That according to him, he says, what are you talking about? This woman has no power whatsoever. None. It doesn't matter where she is. It doesn't matter what rules she makes. It doesn't matter. According to this approach, her reference to 123 Main Street is nothing short of just listing an address. It doesn't matter. It has no halachic bearing. So the Gemara says it's obvious. Says the Gemara, lo tzricha, maybe the case was a little different. To Amr Le, she said, Zila Mizrach, the Isei b'Mizrach. She says, I want you to go east because that's where my husband is. Because Ilamayrav, and he went to the west. Ma'udatema, I might have thought, b'Ma'arav ha Lesa, he's definitely not in the west, and halachically, I shouldn't be concerned about it. Kamash Malan Dilma Bahadid Ka'azil, Megas Goizbe, v'Yoav Lagita. Perhaps that as he's walking even in the west, maybe this guy's actually found in a place where she didn't know where he was, which is not uncommon. People, they go to this gas station, they go to that restaurant, they go to this base medrash, they go to that mincha. Things happen. People drive in different directions. So says the Gemara, because she said just to go to the east, that doesn't stop him from possibly receiving the get, even if he goes to the west. And therefore, kamash malan, that she's gonna have to stop eating truma right away, even if he walks to the west. Says the Gemara, 8 lines down, 7 lines down. Ha'omer l'shlucha. We'll see a conflict here. If a man says to a shliach, "Arev li b'tmarim," I would like for you to make an eruv, please, with dates. But the erev lo begrogeris, but he does it with figs. He does it with a different type of fruit. Or begrogeris v'eruv lo b'tmarim. If I ask you to make an eruv with fruit or vegetable number 1, and instead you make it with fruit or vegetable number 2, so tanichada eruvo eruv. According to one shita, eruvo eruv, that is still a perfectly valid eruv you can carry within that mavoi, whatever the case may be. The Tanya Idach, another source holds ein eruvo eruv. No, it's not necessarily true. So to this machlokes in the Tanaim between the 2 brisas, we have 2 answers. Answer number 1 is as follows: about a quarter of the way down. Omar Rabba says lo kasha. One of these brisas is harabanan, and the other brisa is harabi Elazar. Which one is which? Harabanan, which one is the one that is of the sheet of the Rabbanan, the Amre Kpeda? We could easily say that this is a Kpeda, that if I'm the person who's telling you what I want the eruv made out of, I have the right to tell you exactly what I want it to be made out of. Conversation over. I'm allowed to decide that you're giving this over only with one particular type of fruit. But Rebbe Lazar, according to the other brisa, perhaps that's the sheet of Rebbe Lazar, who says that the fact that you indicated a particular fruit is completely irrelevant. Just a fruit, just get it done. So that's a machlokes tanoim, and that's how Rabba approaches the Gemara. For Rav Yosef Amar, no, have harabanan. Really, both are possibly within the sheet of the Rabbanan. And remember, the Rabbanan just a moment ago were Kpeda. So how do we understand both brisas? I understand the brisa where we say Ein eruvo eruv because of Kpeda. But says the Gemara, how do we understand this according to the Rabbanan? Because says the Gemara, a third of the way down, Kan b'shalo, Kan b'shel chavero. In one brisa, we're talking about his own stuff, and therefore eruvo eruv. And in another case, we're talking about Kan b'shel chavero. We're talking about fruits that aren't even yours. You have no right to take my fruit and make an eruv with it. So that's what the Gemara says is how we could understand the Gemara according to Rav Yosef. And then the Gemara says, Amar le Abaye ve'elahad Tanya. What about another very, very similar case? Ha'omer l'shlucho, if a man says to his shaliach, Arev li b'migdal ve'irev le b'shovach. I tell the man not about what, but where. I'd like you to make the eruv in the tower, and instead you make the eruv near the chicken coop. Or b'shovach, I want you to make the eruv near the chicken coop, and ve'irev lo b'migdal. In such a case, there too, very similar to the previous case where the guy didn't listen, the shliach was a little bit rebellious. There too, the Tanya Chada, we have one brisa that says eruvo eruv, and v'tanya idach any eruvo eruv. So says the Gemara, you can't tell me that the difference of Rav Yosef is kan b'shelo, kan b'shel chaveru, because hasa mai shelo v'shel chaveru ika. Rav Yosef's answer doesn't stand up to the test of time. We're not talking about the product. We're talking about the location. So the machlokas that we have about location, where the location is the right location and the product is not even in discussion, you can't say the product was one person's and the product was another's to answer up the two brises. So says the Gemara, Hasam nami ika pire de migdal u pire de shovach. Not true. It could be that there are fruits that are specific to the migdal and fruits that are specific to the shovach. And in one case, they could be shelo, they could be his. And in one case, it can be shal chavero. And therefore, Rav Yosef is able to withstand the test of the Gemara. And therefore, while we don't have a conclusion of who we hold like, it's possible that when we have these two sets of cases, one about the shliach not listening to which food to use for the eruv, and the other about the shliach not listening to which location to put the eruv. In both cases, both answers work. One possible answer is that of Rabbah, which is a quarter of the way down, which we saw is Rabbanan Rabbi Lazar. And the second answer of Rabbi Yosef is that it's all Rabbanan, but maybe one product is shelo and one product is shel chavero, and that explains in both cases the distinctions between the two brises. That brings us to another Mishnah, which is halfway down. The Gemara says, "Ha'omer kisvu get utznula ishti." If a man says, "Write a get and give it to my wife," or if he says, "Gershuha, please divorce her," or "Kisvu igeres utznula," write a letter and give it to her. Hare elu. In all of these cases, if a shliach hears this, if edim hear this, then yichtavu v'yidnu. What about, however, the language of patruha, parnasuha, asula kinimus, asula kiroi? Patruha, you should free her. Parnasuha, you should give her sustenance. Code word for ksuba. Or asula kinimus, do what is appropriate. Asula kiroi, do what's right. In all of these cases, lo amar klum, because in all of these cases, there are different understandings of what they could mean. Patruha, please go free her. Maybe she's stuck in her car. There's 100 things that they could mean. Unless the language is clear, you cannot get divorced with language that's ambiguous. That's the end of the Mishnah. And the Gemara opens with some brises that are very similar. Tanu Rabbanon, Shalchuha, send her out. Shavkuha, leave her. Tarchuha, another language of sending her out. Says the Gemara, Hare elu yichtibu v'yitnu. These are languages that suffice for divorce. They're not terribly ambiguous, and we accept them. The Brisa continues, Patruha parnasua asula kanimus asula karoilo amar klum, basically a quote from our Mishnah that those languages are too ambiguous. Tanya, we have a Brisa. Rabbi Nasan Omer Patruha dvarav kayamin. Reb Nasan, this is a Brisa. Reb Nasan was a Tana. He says the language of Patruha, that works. Now, if you look in our Mishnah says Patruha doesn't work. If you look in the Brisa at the beginning of the Gemara, Patruha doesn't work. But Reb Nasan holds that Patruha works. Says the Gemara, let's finish Reb Nasan's shita. Patruha dvarav kayamin, but pitruha lo amar klum. So how do we understand the shita of Reb Nasan? It's odd in two different ways. First of all, the difference between patruha and pitruha is tiny. It's a chirik. It's not a big difference. And second of all, why is he going against the other shitas? If the word is ambiguous, it's ambiguous. If it's not, then it's not. So it says the Gemara, Amar Rava, we're 2/3, a little bit more, 3/4 of the way down. Rabbi Nasan de Bavlahu. He was from Bavel. It's not so common. There were Tanaim who lived in Bavel, but it wasn't every day. Most of the Tanaim that we know of lived in Eretz Yisrael. The Gemara says that in regards to Reb Nasan, he was from Bavel, and Daik, he makes an inference, Bein Pitruha lip Patruha. Pitruha is a nothing, and Patruha in their culture, in their lexicon, was a normal word with which to get divorced. Tana Didan, what about the author of our Mishnah, who says that Patruha is lo amar klum? So there says the Gemara, he is the bar Eretz Yisrael and lo daik. They don't have the same implications, the same inflection of the words. The words mean different things. So that's very, very, very important. Let's say a man lives in one culture, he's trying to divorce a woman from another culture. He uses a word that in his culture is meaningful, and in her culture isn't meaningful. So okay, we have to get it and figure out who gets to choose the language? Does she have to understand? Does she not have to understand? If Reb Nasan says Patrua, which works for him, and his wife is from Eretz Yisrael, and she doesn't understand, is she divorced? Okay, all of the shilas. But that's why there's a difference between them. Says the Gemara, Ibayaluhu hotziuha mahu. What about the language of hotziuha? Take her out. Azavuha, leave her, mahu. Hitiruha, permit her, mahu. Hinichuha, leave her, mahu. Ho'ilu la, mahu, to help her. Asu la kedas, do what is appropriate by her, mahu. So says the Gemara, with all of these, we don't have all the answers, but pshot mihachad, we do have an answer for some of them. The Tanya, the Brisa writes, 8-9 lines from the bottom of Samach Hamid Beis. The Brisa writes, the Tanya asu la kedas, that language of asu la kedas and asu la kenimus and asu la keroi, lo amar klum, those are 0 languages. That brings us to the next Mishnah, which is 7 lines from the bottom of Samach Hamid Beis. Let's continue. Barishona, initially they used to say, Hayu omrim hayotze bekolar, if a man was being brought out in chains, which is code word for he was about to be executed. V'omar, and he said, Kisvu get leishti. He says, I want you to write a get to my wife. He doesn't say to give it to her. He just says, I want you to write a get to my wife. Under those circumstances, even though he only spoke about the ksiva, we assume that his intent was also for the nesinim. Chazru Lomar, they then expanded this idea to say that not only do we say that it's true about Hayotze B'Kolar, that a man that's being brought to the gallows, but it's also true of Hayotze B'Shayar, even in a much less severe case, where a man is going out on a caravan, he's going out on a trip. In those cases, if he says Kasfu, we assume that he's also somewhat confused, distracted, overwhelmed by his trip, and therefore we assume that even though he said Kisvu, we also assume that he means Nasnim. Kasvu. Says the Gemara, Reb Shimon Shizuri Omer Afa Mesukan, even someone who is a chole, Rashi says. Let's pick up in the Gemara. The Gemara begins with a story, 3 lines from the bottom on Samach Hamid Beis, heading to the Mishnah, 2/3 of the way down on Samach Vav Amud Aleph. Geniva Yotze B'Kol Arhava. Geniva had been imprisoned, and he was being taken out to the gallows to be executed. Ki Hava Konafik, on his way out, Amar, he said loud enough for people in the pews to hear. He said, Havu arba mea zuze, I'd like you to please give 400 zuz, Rabbi Avina mechamra de naharpanya. I'd like you to give him 400 zuz I'd like you to give Rabbi Avina 400 zuz from the wine of naharpanya. Mechamra de naharpanya. Amar Rav Zera. Rav Zera says, Dora Rav Avina lesilte. Rashi says, Yiton Rav Avina Salo al Kasefo, go pack your bags, he says to Rav Avina, who was meant to be the recipient of this money, and the Aza Lagabe Rav Huna Rabbe, and you should go to Rav Huna because Rav Huna agrees with this psak, that when a person is brought out Bikolar, that if he only says half of a sentence, and in this case all he said was Havu, was given to him, that this is considered sufficient for the transaction, and the 400 zuz would in fact go to Rav Avina. Where do we know this from? Samach Vav Amud Aleph, 2 lines down. Damar Rav Huna, Gito Kimatanaso. A get is no different than a matana. How so? In 2 ways. Aleph, ma matanaso im amar chazar. Just like a matana, let's say miraculously, this person, Geniva, whatever the case may be, doesn't end up getting killed, and he had said a matana, during that time. If he's amad, if he withstands the challenge, then choser, then the item goes back. Av gito you amad choser. Okay, that's number 1. It doesn't help our case over here. Number 2, ma gito afal gav de lo parish. Just like a get, even though it wasn't clear, even though he only said right, and he wasn't very clear about the giving piece, so therefore the Gemara says that Rav Huna clearly aligns with the shita that we see in our Gemara, that a case of Yotze B'Kolar, it actually is the real deal, and that's why the Gemara says that Reb Zera sent Reb Avina to Rav Huna to make sure that he would actually collect on his money. Says the Gemara, wait 1 second. Masif lo Rabbi Abba. Your comparison between get and matana has a little bit of a faulty foundation. Says the Gemara, Ima matana yeshna la'achar misa. But there's a difference, because by a matana, a man can say before he dies that after he dies, he'd like the matana to go to person X. Yeshna la'achar misa, that can happen. But af get yeshna la'achar matana, but there is no get after misa, excuse me. Af get yeshna la'achar misa, there is no get achar misa. Therefore, get and matana are really not comparable. Says the Gemara, hachi hashta, what are you talking about? Bishlam matana isa la'achar misa, ela get la'achar misa mi'ika. How can you say that there's any comparison between the two? They're apples and oranges. They're not the same thing at all. Ella, Rabbi Abba says, Hachi kakashale. This is actually what the question was. Matnas shchiv meira b'miktzas he. We're talking about a case of a matnas shchiv meira, but only b'miktzas. He's only a partial matnas shchiv meira. Rashi says, not that he's not a sick person, he is, but he's not giving away all of his funds. Take a look at Rashi, 12 lines down or so, Dibur hamaschel b'miktzas, shishir la'atzmo, shelo nosan kol nechasav. If you give over all your nechasim, you're good to go. But if you don't give over all your nechasim, then that creates a problem. And says the Gemara, umatnas shchiv meira b'miktzas baya kinyan. That when we're talking about a shchiv meira, who doesn't give over all of his items, he only gives over a percentage of his items, or I should say, almost all of his items. As long as it's not 100%, then he has to make a proper kinyan. Bechlal, what that implies from here is the Rav Huna Savar lo boya kinyan. The Rav Huna holds that in the case of matna shchiv meira, when a person who's on his deathbed says something, he says, "I want to give all but 10% to person X." That's a problem because really that should require a kinyan, and it implies from here that if Shita number 1 holds that we don't need it, it implies that Rav Huna holds that we do need it. Says the Gemara, how can you say that? After all, it seems to be that really taka there is a kinyan, or that we hold that there needs to be a kinyan. So how do we explain Rav Huna? Says the Gemara, shiny hacha, the mitzvah machmas misahu. This is a little bit different because it's different than a case of shchiv meira. What's different? Our case of Geniva, the case of Yotzei B'Kolar. In that case is you're listening to what the mace is about to say, and there's a mitzvah to listen to him. So you can't compare that to a case of a shchiv meira. Says the Gemara, Michlal, that implies the Rabbi Abba sabar mitzvah machmas misa boya kinyan. That would then imply that in the case of the Yotzei B'Kolar, that we would need a kinyan. But we don't hold that way. We hold that there is no kinyan under the circumstances. So says the Gemara, let's try again. Ela Rabbi Abba hachi kakashele. Really, what was bothering Rabbi Abba was the language that we have at the very bottom of Samech Hamid Beis. Look at that very last line. What was the line that Geniva said when he was going to the gallows? He said, here's 400 zuz Rabbi Avina, mechamra de Naharpanya, from the wine of Naharpanya. Now, again, as we spoke about the other day, sometimes it's difficult for us to appreciate some of the subtleties of language because we didn't live in their times. We didn't speak the slang. We didn't speak the language. We still don't speak the language. So here the Gemara says, chamra, we're a third of the way down on Samach Vav Merav, chamra, lo ka'amar. He didn't say chamra on its own. What did he say? He said me chamra. He didn't say dmei chamra, the cost of the wine, the financial equivalent of the wine, lo ka'amar. He says me chamra ka'amar, and that's a little bit difficult. And that's why Rabbi Abba had a little bit of a problem with the line that we were talking about at the bottom of that page. V'idach, what would the other shita say? Mechamra kedeli yapo says kocha. No, mechamra is actually a broader language. This is how some of the Meforshim explain. It's a broader language that makes sure you get the entire gift. What does that mean? If I would have said chamra, so then what that means is that if the wine turns to vinegar, then you don't get the wine. It means any other variety of scenarios where the wine goes bad. But mechamra, from that wine, even though the language is again dakus halashon, it's very similar, but that's what the Gemara means. It's liyapo says kocho. It actually strengthens this case in shalchu mitam. This was something we learned in Eretz Yisrael. Mechamra liyapo says kocho. It actually makes it better for the recipient. In this case, Rabbi Avi, that he would actually get the full 400 zuz, no matter what the case may be. Last Mishnah and Gemara for the day, says the Gemara halfway down in the Mishnah on Samach Vav Amud Aleph, Mishahaya Mushlach Lebor, if a man falls into a pit, the Amar, and he calls out, Kola Shomea es Kolo, he calls out to anyone who can hear his voice, and what does he say? Yichtov get li ishto. Someone should write his wife again. He said the ksiva part, not the nesina part. We know what his intentions are. He doesn't want his wife to be an aguna. He's being a good guy, and he just wants to make sure that she doesn't get stuck in a marriage when he's actually dead. The Gemara asks the oddest question. Perhaps this person is a demon. I didn't make this up. That's what the Gemara says. The guy who was at the lip of the bore couldn't see the person in detail, but he was able to see the shape of a person. He looked like a person, 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head, looked like a person. Says the Gemara, inhu nami, demons as well, idmu ye idmu. They also look like that. Says the Rashi, a crazy Rashi. Rashi's 2/3 of the way down. The first one by the Gimel Mem, idmu ye idmu, pa'amim she'osin atzman b'dmus adam. They can morph into different shapes, and sometimes they're in the shape of people. So perhaps this really was a shade, and it really wasn't a person. Says the Gemara, Dechazule bavoa. No, because I saw a shadow. I saw this guy's shadow, and shadim don't have shadows. Says the Gemara, Inhu nami islu bavoa. No, that's not true. Shadim do have shadows. This is an idea we've seen before, and the Gemara says, no, the chazule bavoa de bavoa. I saw a double shadow. There were 2 streams of light, and in the 2 streams of light, we were able to see a double shadow, and that's a raya brura that it's a person. Says the Gemara, V'dilma inhu nami islahu. Perhaps they too have a double shadow. Amar Reb Chanina, limdani Yonasan bini, or Yonasan Shida, Yonasan the shade, one of the two. Also, we've seen this before. Bavoa Islahu, Bavoa de Bavoa Leslahu. That shadim don't have two shadows, they only have one. If it says the Gemara, Badilma Tzorahi, maybe it's the co-wife. How far do we go? Maybe the co-wife was also stuck in there, and she wanted to get rid of the other wife. So she said in as deep a voice as possible, she pulled out the baritone notes, and she said, anyone who sees my wife, my name is so-and-so, and I want to get divorced from my wife number one, whatever the case may be. Maybe it was a tzara. Says the Gemara, Tana de Rabbi Shmuel, maybe, but b'shasa sakana kosin v'nosin nafal pishein makir. Doesn't matter. Once you hear, you may not recognize the voice, but once you hear the person's name is Ploni Almoni, and his wife's name is Rachel, whatever, and this is the city they live in, all the requirements of the get, once you hear all that information, we no longer care about the quality of the voice, and we accept that get at face value because of the sakana. We're going to stop right here. My apologies for changing the schedule. My children's flight plans got delayed, and I therefore have to go pick them up during Daf Yomi time. Wishing you all a beautiful night.